wishing I could take a break from this world. Running on a hamster wheel, but searching for something I can't feel. I just wanna be a lost girl and fly. Take a breath, feel my wings spread, levitate above the ground and make eye contact with clouds. Now I'm rising, I'm soaring above it all. I just wanna be free, finally, finally, finally. I wanna be free, finally, finally, finally. I wanna be free, finally, finally, finally. I wanna be free, finally, 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 finally. I always stay dreaming, never imagined I lose my spark. Living in this crazy time, putting back the pieces of my mind. I know how to run from the dark and fly. Feel my wings spread, levitate into the clouds. I'm so high above the ground. I'm rising, I'm soaring above it all. I just wanna be free, finally, finally, I wanna be free.
Race, conversations, and law enforcement. This is Moses' People Speak.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Moses People Speak. I'm your host, Terry Watson, the founder of Strategies for Justice. Oh man, it's been a long time and I'm just so happy to be back. I'm hoping everyone is having a wonderful and a peaceful summer. And I'm actually very, very excited about today's conversation. But before we get started, just a few things I want people to know about before we get started. One, if you want to be a guest on Moses People Speak, if you got a story to share, please consider being a guest. You can scan that QR code. We are always looking for people to share their stories and definitely to keep this conversation going. So definitely consider being a guest on Moses People Speak. The very next thing I want to mention is congratulations to our brother Edwin Raymond, who was appointed the sheriff of New York City. I'm very happy to see this happen. I wrote a piece on why that's important to the conversation around accountability and transparency. So again, good luck, Edwin Raymond, and we are definitely have you in our prayers and our best wishes. And next announcement is the book is finally coming out this winter, Racial Line, Blue Lines. Thank you to all the folks, the law enforcement folks that sat down with me to have an interview with Eleanor and I. If you want to be part of the mailing list to get updates on the actual date of release, as well as any book signings, please scan that QR code and join the mailing list. And we will also post a link later on in the comment section. Talking about books, I want to talk about this one book that came across my desk, and I will put it up here too, because those who know, I actually read books, and you can even see my little sticky note sticking out of there. But the book is titled "Just Breathe: How Managing the Breath Helps Public Safety Make Mindful, Value-Driven Decisions at Work and at Home." And again, is written by my dear sister, Dr. Tracie Keesee, who is waiting backstage. Just before I bring Tracie on, I gotta say, I found this book to be not just applicable to those who are in the law enforcement or the first responding field, but I even said to Tracie, I see this as being applicable to anyone who is managing or leading, definitely in these stressful times. So those who don't know, Dr. Tracie is a national recognized leader in policing culture, community safety, bias, equity, and wellness. A retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department and former deputy commissioner for the NYC Police Department. She has dedicated her career to transforming the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. So without further ado, I want to welcome Tracie to Moses People Speak.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have to pause when you start reading bios. I don't know if anybody else does it. It's just like, first of all, you make me sound really old and tired. It's just like, man, I'm telling you.
You know, I'll do it well. I was just gonna read your whole bio, but I figured, you know what, that I know that feeling when you listen to your bio, you're like, oh man, I gotta come on after that.
The only person that loves that is my mother. She'll be the first one to tell you. Repeat. But yeah, no, I'm good.
No, I'm so blessed to have you on this. And like I said, again, I'm a huge fan of all that you've done, the work that you've done with the Center for Peace and Equity, all the work you've done with NSBP. But then the book came out, and when I got the book again, I'm a huge proponent of mindfulness, first of all, right? So that's one thing, right? But then I started reading the book, and not just the concept that you were listing in the book, but also it was applicable to anyone that might find themselves in a stressful situation as a manager. And again, because you focus on law enforcement, Tracie, I say there's probably no profession more stressful than that. So if you can deal with that level of stress, then it could be very applicable to any field. But before we get started, just tell me, what was the thought behind writing the book? Why did you think that was important to put this book out there?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation, because you're always so open to the conversation. And I will tell you, because you are we say multi-book author, right? I don't know how you all do this, because it was stressful enough just with this one. And I'll get to your question in a minute, but I just remember that I was still traumatized from my dissertation. I hadn't even, wrapped my mind around that, then to sit down and to do this. But I will tell you that, this came around. I was always asked about writing a book, and you should write about your career and the whole 9 yards. And I was a firm believer. It's like, nobody wants to read that, right? The only person who wants to read it is your mom. Nobody wants to read that. But I sat and I had to think for a minute about not just my career, but the experiences that I had with folks in leadership and people not in leadership too, because you mentioned something that I think is very, very important. This is not just applicable to law enforcement. It's applicable to anybody who is going through stress. So one of the things that I was thinking about when this came to be was we often talk about self-regulation and the ability to have wellness as it's a luxury. Right. So this is something you have to schedule all the time. It costs money. You got to go to the spa to do this. And it's not that. And one of the things I tell folks, and even, I teach graduate school, it's a necessity for a leader to be able to self-regulate. And so I was looking around. I've got some colleagues who've done some great work on mindfulness, which, this is what I consider to be the foundation for mindfulness. But we really weren't talking about self-regulation as a leadership core sort of principle for that. And so for me, it's about how do you sustain yourself when we in law enforcement are taught really how to stay in sort of the zone and perform under pressure. But little time is taught. And I remember my own academy years in regards to how do you move away from that, right? So how do you regulate that? So when you're in a constant ready state, the body does all kinds of things. And when you're in the academy, we also teach you to keep those two things separate, right? Because we need you focused. And, we'll talk about a little bit about this. I hope we'll touch on it. But this is not just about, recruits and law enforcement. This is also about retirement. So when you get done, when you're done, right? What you want to hope happens is that you've prepared yourself from a stressful, situation, but you've been able to manage that. And what we're finding now with retirees is we're seeing an increase in suicides with retirees. And so for me, the sort of the impetus of the book is one in which self-regulation is a leadership principle, but it's also free. And it's something that we should be teaching, not just, recruits, but everybody, people that we work with. We have, as you mentioned, you manage people, you're around people, you're in groups, you do group. I always say, if you have to do a group project, this is the best time to be self-regulated. So for me, those were some of the pieces behind wanting to do this.
Yeah, and I'll share. Like, I think that the week that I got your book, I had to practice some of those techniques that particular week.
Yeah.
It was a really difficult week, and I remembered. And by the way, I've been a huge fan of your podcast, Just Breathe. Those
you.
who don't know,
Thank you.
I did list the link to Just Breathe in the actual invitation to this. So if you still have the
Thank you.
link, you can find a link to Just Breathe. Or if you want to be fancy and scan your QR code because you forgot or have you not, you can scan your QR code right here. So you
Man.
see what the book and as well as the podcast. Now I gotta tell you, there was a few episodes that was in your podcast. We'll talk about your podcast in a minute too, but I think the conversation that you've been having about the self-regulation, and then you mentioned the suicide with police officers that are retiring. Tracie, you probably remember the symposium that we did on mental health and policing. I believe you actually were one of the keynotes. And that was a big conversation even back then, is that when law enforcement folks are retiring because they haven't figured out how to self-regulate whilst on the job, they still have that trauma and did not know how to deal with that. Any thoughts on, and I know your book covered this as well, any thoughts on why that self-regulation is important to have that conversation on the job whilst they're still there?
Well, I mean, the self-regulation is just a couple of things, right? So first of all, it is a health matter for the individual. So the ability to, manage self, and this doesn't mean that you don't go around, you're never mad, right? Because I've had to correct a lot of folks, like, sit here on this cushion and just breathe. It's like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ability to recognize when your body is starting to react. And when we do this, and we know the physiology of all of that, when you start to do that, then your ability to think without oxygen, those windows and doors close, so you can't get access to all the tools that you have or you've been trained to have. And so one of the things that I think that is important is learning how to do that also has always been related to de-escalation and how you're managing a call or how you're interviewing someone who may be a survivor or a victim. And I have to tell you, back in the day, and I'll do this and for the folks, and I'm laughing because Sean gets this, back in the day, this was not the conversation, right? And we were growing up, this was the suck it up, move on, put some dirt on it, walk it off. We always would say swallow, right? So you would be suppressing those things down, and eventually you press enough that when you compound those things, it starts to seep out, and it seeps out in varying different ways. And we've learned that now, but back then we did not. And oftentimes you would have folks who are trying to regulate or have been traumatized, and then they would have different kinds of reactions, whether they're short, whether they're yelling, whether they're sick and not showing up, which we then equate to a behavioral issue, right? So Tracie's she's calling in sick, so she must be, playing or something. We would look at the patterns to see if you called in on a Friday versus a Monday, right? And we would never, if you did not know your people, like most of us, if you went through the ranks as a supervisor, then for me, that was the missed opportunity. And it took me a while to learn that. And I think that that's why now it's so important. We didn't know what we knew then that we know now. And we always say this, right, especially to our children, to our grandchildren. I wish I could have said back then, this was the way that we moved, but it just was not. And it wasn't a trait that we also consider to be professional. Your ability to suck it up and come back to work the next day is what made you a good cop, so that you could hold that down. And people, even, the best folks who are healthy and, moving through are some of the most that are struggling. So, yeah.
Well, do you mind? So, I gotta say, when I was reading your book, and I I like to, like I said, put my little sticky notes in there and make notes. There was one quote that I really stuck to, or let's say the quote that stuck to me, and I wrote it down. It was on page 27. It was stress that is not processed does not disappear. It transfers. And that was one of those quotes I just read over and over and over again. And honestly, I was discussing this with that particular quote with some folks on my team, because I'm not in law enforcement, but I think that in some elements, the role that I play at a university could be stressful too.
Sure.
And as a manager or supervisor, I think it's my responsibility to make sure that I'm not transferring that stress on to my colleagues or those whom I supervise. But in this particular quote, and I would love you to comment on this too. So my question, in your opinion, what is missing from leadership when it comes to creating a space that promotes the processing of stress? And please share, what does it look like, Tracie?
So let's go back to the quote that you love, and I'm glad you do, right?
Yes.
And what it's mentioning is that it doesn't disappear. And you heard me sort of like mention this before. It's kind of
Right.
what the biology of a spillover, right? So if you fill up a cup all the way and then it starts to run over, so sort of use that analogy. But what happens is that you start to not only run over, but it impacts the way that you interact with people. It impacts the way that you make decisions. It is a horrible impact on your health and your wellness, that we know. And when you have leaders that have compounded stress or even compounded trauma, it shows up in ways in which we would say, dude's a jerk. I'll keep it clean, right? Dude's a jerk.
Right.
But we have no idea what is going on with Terry. But all I know is when Terry shows up for roll call, he is either short or he's yelling at people. He is off the charts on a lot of different things. When you try to ask questions or try to get a response, a lot of times it can come off as really, defensive. And so for leaders and for leadership, it's important that not only do you model this, but you also need to know how to self-regulate. And I'll tell you one of the things that has happened post George Floyd, that the word trauma is new in a sense to policing, and the fact that it's being used and associated with officers, right? Trauma usually had been reserved for victims and survivors. So we have this now, and we are good at taking language and words and using them, but not understanding the full meaning behind them. And so one of the after effects of that were, departments creating wellness programs, right? So mental health, all kinds of programs where folks can come and get help if they want. And what you would sometimes have is that you would have a department that spends a lot of money to create these, and you would have a chief who would sit in a convening or, at a conference and say, we've got the best wellness team and we've got all these, resources, but they themselves were showing something very different. And you know how we are. We're words, but we watch you, right? We watch you. So you are, on one hand, telling everyone that your agency is taking good care of folks. But when you're in the house, you're acting a fool. And everybody's looking at you like, what happened to the wellness part, right? What happened to creating those spaces where we can go? And so you find some performative pieces there. But what it can look like, though, and I think this is the reason why the book was designed the way it was, is that it can have moments of pausing before roll call to ground everybody, just to breathe, just to sort of just like, let's just be here. Right. And one of the things that I do when I do in class is I'll have folks to say, give me one word that describes how you're showing up right now. Right. And I do this with folks that I'm talking to, and they'll say, tired, whatever the deal is. So you do that as a leader because it allows you then to adjust yourself to people. Not everybody trying to adjust to you. Right. It allows you, you're the leader. Adjust yourself. If your team is saying we're fed up, we're tired, we're burned out, then you should be having a conversation around what is happening. Right. And you should also have the and this is where people sort of miss the boat. You should also be self-reflective enough to know if you're the cause of the problem. I can't tell you how many people we've had conversations with who are just stunned, right? You were talking about deer in the headlights. They're stunned when we say you're the problem, right? They're like, that can't be. It's not you're the problem. So if your team is burnt out and they keep telling you this, and all you keep doing is piling it on, you're the problem. And so, for these conversations, and I do this with leadership as well, but for these conversations, there's a lot of self-reflective work that has to happen with leaders, and they need to understand how they show up, right? Not only how they show up, but they themselves oftentimes can be triggered by things that happen as well, because they haven't dealt with whatever issues and experiences they have. So when we talk about the spillover and the compounding, you can have a pool filling up because everybody's doing the same thing. Right. So it's a matter of making sure that people are not just getting the help that they need, but people are trained as leaders and managers to understand what you're seeing. What are you looking at? And that's where we fall short, is people don't know what they're seeing and they don't know what they're looking at.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because I think when I read that piece there, and the reason why it sort of stuck with me is like I think as a leader, one of the things the most simple thing we could do is show by example, right? So if you're not able to deal and process that stress, then to assume that the folks that are following you can process stress, that is really not applicable. Right? I mean, it's really not realistic. I mean, and so this that conversation, and again, I'm going back to your book because then I wanted to dive into your podcast a little bit because I guess I think I'm 2 episodes behind. I literally binged your podcast, Tracie.
Okay.
And it was funny. I think the last one I watched was the brother who was also I believe a pastor or a clergy of
Yeah,
some sort.
Niles.
And
Yes.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I was having some conversations in my workplace because and that's to dive into your podcast because again you're talking about the concept of breathing and self-regulating and you're bringing in different speakers that can speak to different elements to that. So let me ask you this question because I also was really intrigued by some of your guests who came on and talked about relationships and how the concept of bringing that stress from the job to the from the workplace to home, which your book really does cover really well, how that impacts relationship. And as you know, the divorce rate in first responders is ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm IR1. I'm not gonna sit up here and throw stones. I get it. I absolutely get it. But
So,
I mean,
I want you to dive into that a little bit, Tracie, when you can.
So yeah, and I don't say that in jest. I mean that's the fallout, right? So, we have, as you mentioned, wonderful guests that come on, and Dr. Ellen Kushner is the one that we sort of go to, and we have a couple of psychologists that we use, but we had to talk about the impact of the family, right? We don't often, we usually focus on the officer, which is fine. We're not saying that that's the wrong thing to do, but we often don't talk about the support systems or the family. And so you can imagine when officers are, if you're showing up with this level of trauma and you have all kinds of things. You don't even have to have a spillover. You can just show up. I am always surprised where leaders are assuming that they somehow leave that behind and go home and step through the threshold as though, as Tracie, as if none of this happened today and I'm good. And that's not the case. What happens is that if you don't process those things, you take them with you. You come home with it. Right. And we'll talk about rituals around that, but you come home with it. And usually what happens if you have a good partner, or a spouse, they begin to pick up really quickly the signals. So if Tracie comes in quiet and not saying much, they often, and the sort of the understanding and learning this is trial by fire, right? So the first couple of times you try to ask, and then you get a short response, you get a nasty response, you get no response. So at some point you start to train yourself. Then when Terry comes through the door, I'm not going to ask him how his day is. I'm going to let him do whatever he needs to do. Right. And so Terry comes in, he quietly goes into, usually it's like a TV room or somewhere, sits down, may or may not drink, have a beer or whatever, but just sits there. Yeah. Then you'll start to see if you have children or, even I always say even elderly parents that you're caring for, then you start to see the kids start to regulate themselves around Terry. Right. Because mom says, dad, not now. Right. Let him decompress from work. So the kids are peeking in the room, wanting to say hi to dad, but also being very cautious in their own selves and bodies, not to aggravate. Yes. Right. So now you're regulating in a very different way. And they learn this very young. Right. So it's not like you have to be a teenager to understand this. You understand when your parent says not now.
Oh, yeah.
Your body may want to say, but I wanna, but they're saying no, not now. And in the meantime, Terry's sitting in the room and he's not talking. Right. He's not saying anything about what happened to work. And eventually, if we can get Terry to come to the dinner table with all of us, we try to have that family go, well, how was work today? Well, there's things that happen at work that Terry can't talk about in front of the kids. Right. And so, the response is what? It's fine. Yeah. Right? Did you do anything? It was good. Right. And you get the short kind of not even a conversation, But we know this just from, everyday folks. You don't have to be a police officer to know when your relationship is going bad, right? When you
Yeah.
don't communicate, when you don't talk. Whenever somebody tries to ask you a question and you get short, or you don't want to even talk. So one of the things that we are always been aware of is that those things are taken home. And you mentioned it, right? So we have high divorce rates. We have abuse of alcohol. We have shopping. I'll raise my hand to that one. You have folks that have issues with food. I mean, so you can name it. So any kind of,
Yes.
coping mechanisms, gambling, smoking, all of those things are there. But what we don't teach is, how do you then come home and build a healthy relationship with your folks and your kids and your spouses and partners, so you have a way to decompress and talk about this, right? And
Yes.
usually that's all somebody wants. They just want you, can you tell me about your day? Our fear is, you're not going to get it. Not only are you not going to get it, you're going to judge me, right? Because we have coping mechanisms that in the police department that are not healthy at all. Right. And community members have responded to some of those coping mechanisms, like laughing at a crime scene. Right. And so one of the things that we really press for is that the regulation and breath work and stuff, it's for the entire family. It's not just for the officer. Right. There are things there that are applicable to everybody. And so we want to make sure that when, folks are reading this book, they understand that you are also carrying all of that and you are transferring it right into the house. Suppose a safe space, place where you're supposed to be able to unwind, and you're not dealing with any of it. So the importance of that for families to understand and know that. And we're starting to see this now with the newer generation of officers having, counseling, having these conversations with your partner and spouse before you go into policing, or when you're coming through the TO. Sitting down with kids and explaining to them, there's days and how do we do this? And, so there's ways to make sure we do it. But for officers, they're signaling things that we could and should be doing. And I used to do this, and my husband used to do this as well. So when we came home from work, when you walk into the garage, there's what you used to call, I guess, a mud room, but it's the laundry room basically. And there's a door to the rest of the house. In that closet, in that family, in that laundry room, all of our uniforms are there. Hats, all of it was there. Gun belts, everything was there. So when you stepped into the house, you were in a different set of clothes, right? So you weren't even bringing it in with you. It was like, this is where I drop it and this is where I come in. And things like that, and being able to sit with yourself, even if for it's a few minutes, breath work, or just to, get rid of what happened, or say, I'll process that, but let me say hello to my family, to the people who love me. Right. And to give that space for that. And so, we really try to make sure that we learn these different ways to do that. But it is, how do you sit down with loved ones and explain, what you've gone through? Well, it starts with that. It starts with that part.
And I'm so glad you brought up kids too, because I was thinking about one of the interviews that I did for Racial Lines, Blue Lines. I was interviewing not the detectives themselves. So mom was a detective, dad was a detective. I interviewed the daughter, not the actual detectives. And what was interesting about that conversation was, growing up, she said that they thought they hid some of these stressors, but even as a young child, she noticed them. And so that what you just mentioned is now about the impact on children, especially those. As you know, there's many law enforcement couples out there, but even if it's just one person in that house, law enforcement, just understanding the impact that has on children, it really is something. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. Tracie.
It is something. And we and you just mentioned the interview you had with the daughter, and our daughter is same way, right? And she would just say, I hated it going to high school because the schools have here in Colorado have school resource officers, and of course that your mom knows school resource officer, right? Especially in high school. And now she's 43, 44, and she will tell you she remembers a business. She hated it She said, you know, they come and they go, well, hey, Denise, and you're standing with your friends. You're trying to act like, first of all, you're trying to act like your parents aren't cops. That's the number one thing. But then you're trying to distance yourself from this. But she will tell you, she's tell me now, she say, man, we used to, you know, she remembers things from when she was little. She's just like, there were just things like we'd hear it or we'd see it on TV. And remember, you know, for those of you who don't know, and my daughter was senior in high school when Columbine happened. And so, you know, we often make assumptions around our support systems and our families that they just sort of like, you get it, right? This is what I have to do. And family members will say that just to make you happy, as opposed to saying we're scared and we're not happy and the kids are scared, right? And so I think that we have to remember that those moments are the moments in which we should be engaging, but we have to know how to do that. And a lot of officers don't know how to do that. And I don't, you know, hate to be, I'll be gender specific, but most men don't, and they're not comfortable.
Yeah. You know, one of the things about, again, I'm reading your book, and I work in a very, I say very female heavy dominated field, right? Very few men in my field. And again, I'm mindful of that too, because, you know, just the way that I may show certain emotions or not show emotions. I'm careful with the language that I use because of that. But the thought behind understanding that when I am supervising or I am trying to provide insight to a situation, that I have to be in control of my emotions, or what they call emotional intelligence, right? Be in control of my emotions, understand how my reaction plays out, but because I know someone is watching, and they may be making their own determination of what they see come from myself. Now, you know, so my background, one of the things I love was solution focused therapy, and so that was one of my favorite practices to deliver. And those who don't know about solution focused therapy, we always have the miracle question. So I thought I'll do this one at you, Tracie, because you know, but if the department or the organization had it all together, like, you know, based on the concepts of your book, that is like your perfect, you know, let's call it, I won't say you're perfect, but the department that got it together, the one that you give like the gold star to, what would be some of the first like 3 top behaviors you would probably see?
That's a good one. So I would say that the types of behaviors I would see is I would see a leader that is, to your point, not just regulated, but emotionally intelligent, right? They know what's happening with their people. They know how to engage with that and are comfortable with doing it. The other thing that would be apparent is that if someone needed a space to just be a minute to reground and to sort of just sit with whatever's happened, that would be available to them, that they would be able to go into a room and say, I'll be back. I'll be out in 10 minutes. Not with somebody hanging over your head talking about we got calls stacked up and the whole 9 yards, because that's what's going to happen. That's the reality of it. But there's a space for you to go and just to take a minute to sit with what you just witnessed or what you just did. And giving that pause, right? Because I always talk about the pause. Pause is not a public safety issue. It's a millisecond, but to give somebody just a minute to exhale and to process what they did. The other part of it, which you would see as well, is, you know, at roll calls or after significant events, there would be a, you know, we call them a review or a briefing, but often it really does stay tactical, right? What do we do right? What do we do wrong? But what we don't do is check, right? We don't stop for a minute and just let everybody get into the room. Just everybody sit here and let's just sit for a minute. Let's be silent, right? Let's just be silent. So you can feel what happened, because what we train so well is to separate the mind and the body, right? And I was having a conversation with an old friend of mine from NYPD, and he says, we've normalized abnormal, right? It was like a t-shirt. I'm like, we've normalized abnormal. Right? Yeah. We are telling you that you need to be hyper vigilant all the time. So the body is that way all the time, even when you're at the birthday party, right? And I always use this, and people just look at me like, Tracie, you guys are like, no, I've been to birthday party. where the person comes in and they got their fanny pack on with a gun belt, they got their work boots on, pair of G shorts, that's casual, right? And then the t-shirt
Right.
that has the logo badge on it. And you had a child's birthday party. What's about to pop off over here? Right. And
Right.
but that's what we're talking about, though,
That's
right?
what
So
it
we
is, yeah.
train you to show up that way. And what we don't
Right.
do, as I mentioned earlier, is we don't create the spaces. So for me, those spaces and those moments would be created not only just by leadership, but by the supervisors and between the officers themselves. Right? You have a partner. Some police departments don't have partner, but when you have partner, when the both of you can say, look, let's just what happened? Can we let's stop for a second and just, unpack what just happened. And, and do that. But the default we like to do in police departments is we try to make it suspect. We try to make it, the narrative. We don't need any of this, right? And I get this from retirees, right, who are just a mess, right? And when you have to explain to them, what it is, and it's like, oh, because we get very defensive when we think you're talking about us. We personalize everything, right? We personalize everything. And so I have to tell a lot of folks, you need to step back because everything is not about you, right? That's the hard part. It's not about you. But two, you not even recognizing how you're showing up and what the body's doing to you is the biggest problem.
Right.
So you have departments that create those spaces, those moments. You've got leaders and supervisors and managers who understand, one, how to self-regulate themselves and have the emotional intelligence to pay attention to when something's happening. And I'll do one shout out to a department. I'm sure there's many more. The state of Arizona, the Public Safety Department of Arizona, is starting a sabbatical. So you have so much time on, I think it's like 5 years or so. And then after that, you get to apply for a sabbatical. You can be gone 6 months.
Wow.
Do you know what would happen?
Wow.
Well, people say, well, people won't come back. I said, maybe. I mean, that might be. But can you imagine if you had 6 months to a year, not to answer the, don't look at the computer, don't look at your emails, forget the text, just 6 months.
Just a reboot. Just a reboot.
Right?
Wow.
Right? Now, I don't hear them, and there probably is somebody, because that's how government works. I don't hear them complaining like, it's going to cost us arm and leg. Do you know how much it costs you when you don't take care of people who need to be taken care of? That's the cost. Right? So for me, those spaces have to be created, and it looks like that. But it also looks like there's a redo of the academy instruction, because we learn these behaviors in the academy. And again, not, we don't begrudge and say what's happening is mad, is that we have to learn how to shift with the times. And what this new generation of officers are doing, this is the part that gets me, is that we have officers now who are coming on who are used to having counseling, psychologists, IAPs, breaks. And they often come into these agencies going like, what's wrong with y'all? You just did all of this and you don't even stop to acknowledge that this is happening. And probably one of the better conversations I have with some of the newer officers is around the word resilience, right? And resilience can be good or bad. And this generation is like, yes, I should be resilient, but it shouldn't be the primary focus of my survival, right? So if I have to continue to be resilient, and as I always tell them, say, you need to figure out what's happening in the environment that's causing me to have to do this, right?
Yes.
So how about you do this? How about you take care of the house first? Because we got bullies up in here, we got people up in here, all kinds of things happening, and treating each other badly, right? And they're like, well, how about you fix that first? And then you can worry about how resilient I am. Because if you don't care for the triggers, then that's exactly what you have. And at some point, what you're going to have with this new generation, and some of our tenured people too, is they're done. It's like, I'm going to be on Top Chef. I'm finished with this. Right?
Right.
But that's the reality of it. And that is, for me, it has to be redone. It has to be from recruitment to retirement. And we need to be thinking about wellness in a very, very different way. And some folks are starting to do that, and some of them are not. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I did have a conversation with a sergeant many years ago, and not many years ago, years ago though. But and he was saying to me that the idea of taking a mental health break, or even saying I need to take a mental health break from this right now, could impact their livelihood, because they'd be seen as unfit for duty. And so the fact that Arizona is doing that is that is promising. That's very promising.
It is promising.
Yeah. Just quick shout out to folks who are watching right now. I know we got two sisters on this call already. Sonia, I see Sonia and Shanette. Hi,
Sonia's sister.
hi, folks. Yeah, we love we love those two as well, and I see Sarah there too.
Real deep. That's awesome.
But I really appreciate this conversation. And again, the one last question I have before we go to the favorite one, I call it the favorite question, but is about accountability. So I was mentioning to you before this call is like I was looking through your book, and there are certain elements that really stuck out to me, and I'm looking at the ones that was very applicable to other spaces of industry. And you wrote a chapter on accountability, and it not being about being punitive, right? It's not about being in a punitive area, but really about showing dignity, showing compassion, but also making sure you have that stance, right?
Yeah.
So I would love for you to just to talk about, because we talk about accountability with the law enforcement all the time. And I know that, you do a lot of work in that space too with your organization and your teaching. But can we just dive a little bit about how can the concepts from your book about accountability, how can that be helpful to specifically police departments, but I'm just thinking in general, in management and supervision?
Yeah. So, and thank you for that. And when we talk about accountability, the first thing we think about is a punitive response, right? You just mentioned it.
Right.
And especially in the community thinks that way as well. It's like if
Right.
you're going to, hold somebody accountable, that means there needs to be a loss or some kind of something happening there. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not saying that no one should be held accountable. That is not it at all.
Right.
What we're saying is that there are also underlying conditions to accountability. And a lot of times, in order for you to get that message across and to have those conversations, you have to be able to do that in a way that doesn't come off, as you mentioned it earlier, like you're going to lose your job, right? And the narratives around this are huge because we want accountability. And even inside law enforcement, accountability to leaders means that we have to do something to you, right? Not something for you, but something to you in order for you to be held accountable. And that's not always the case. Oftentimes, and this is not every time, because I know folks will be like, well, I get it. There's millions of stories. But for those of us who were in uniforms, lots of times when we wanted to hold somebody accountable, there were things that we should have been doing before we got to the punitive stage that we did not do, right? And you have to go back and say, if Terry is acting out in this way, and I'll give you the number one example of where this goes off the rails. We get calls, and they still get calls about officers being rude or cursing at people, right? And so the community member will come in, because this happened. The community member came into me. I remember I was the commander of District 5. And she sat down and she said, I have never been talked to the way I was talked to by this officer. I understand, they have a job to do, but this was beyond what needed to happen. And I said, can you repeat to me what the officer said to you? And she did. And what happened for me was the language that she used, the way in which she said it, the sentence, I know exactly who said it. Because that is the words and the sort of the tenor that they use whenever they get with somebody they don't care for. And so for me as a leader, I get what I need from her. But for me, I immediately call the officer in and say, did you have this conversation? And then you can't really go like, no, because we got body worn camera. What are you going to do? That's not me. We have that too.
Right.
But you ask them, what is going on with you that you think that was an appropriate response? We don't do that. What we do is we start writing up stuff, and then we bring you in, we say, right? Or we're putting you in the system, and we don't sit down and figure out what is the hell's going on what is going on with you, right? What is happening with you? And I'm not saying that's the case every time, but I'm saying that whenever we do this with people, even our own folks, you don't have to be in law enforcement, right? Even people you work with, right? You have to ask yourself, what is going on with you? And when you come out of the narrative, immediately you need to be punished. Something is wrong. You're not right. That is what we're talking about when we're saying accountability. If you really want to hold somebody accountability, Start with what is keeping them from being accountable. And we don't do that.
Right.
We just come rolling right out. And so for me, it is one of those things where, and I'm not talking about, we always like to do the extreme examples like, well, he was flailing. It's like, that's not what I'm talking about. The everyday interactions that law enforcement have, majority of those are the kind of conversations you and I are having. Less than 4% of those are what we call high crime calls, right? Shots fired, running. It's this. It's you and I.
Right.
It's you needing something, me needing to respond to you about something. And then whatever happens in exchange might prompt the need to hold someone accountable to it. But we don't do that. And the narrative and the culture in policing needs to change from that. And we do, and somebody reminded me of this the other day, we do how we were treated. And we get this with folks who've been abused, right? Abused people abused. We treat how we were treated, right? I didn't have the opportunity to say what was going on with me. You don't need one, right? I'm okay, right? I'm fine.
Yeah.
And we know the science now tells us the number one reason why officers will not go to wellness or use wellness programs because they don't think they have a problem.
Yeah.
They don't think they have a problem. I'm like, and you've spent millions of dollars with logo shirts and all this kind of stuff, and people sitting in and the person's walking around like, I'm good. You all are all the problem. Right. So for me, that cultural piece and those narratives and conversations have to change. That's a leadership issue. That's a training supervisory issue. It's a management issue. So when you sit there and you say, well, I called in sick and they did so-and-so to me, right? Doesn't mean that's what Terry's issue is just because it happened to you. But that is the default. And so for your accountability piece, that's what we're talking about when we say, how do you do accountability? And how do you own? How do you own? You got to own. Organizations.
And again, I think that's very applicable across the board. Like when we see this in so many industries where behavior is allowed to continue throughout time, and it becomes the norm, and then it becomes a toxic environment. Like my dear sister Terrell said, just drop some jewels. I love that.
But it's true though what you just said, and that's, let me tell you, you can talk to anybody who is in policing or retired policing. There is not one person who doesn't have a story of the person that probably should have been fired, demoted, or moved on their way. And then what we do is we, as you just mentioned, we start moving Tracie around, right? Well, Tracie created drama over here. We're gonna send her over here to this. And sometimes it's a better job, right? So we're not even punishing Tracie. We're making Tracie a detective, and everybody's like, wait a minute. I've been on that list for years. And so then to your point, we move them around, and then we are so shocked and clutching pearls when Tracie's doing the same thing over there that she was doing over here because you didn't want to deal with Tracie. So we have the organization conversation a lot. Organizations are complicit in the environments that are producing these people. And you as a leader are responsible for making sure that those things stop. That's it. Full stop.
And I know you saw, Tracie, the comment that was made by Dr. Terrell Robinson. She said that law enforcement and military veterans have the same behaviors. And I know Terrell is a retired veteran herself and can speak to that conversation. But like I said, it's the industry. It's so applicable to so many different industries.
It is.
So with that said, I'm going to tell people, please continue asking questions. There are some questions coming in right now. And I want to go back to those questions. But before we start asking those questions, I always have the question I ask every guest that come on this show. And Dr. Tracie, you are no different to that question or getting asked that question. That question, I know it's funny how I always gear up to ask that question. Like,
asked before.
But Tracie, I love to ask you this question, of course, because I appreciate what you've brought to this conversation. But what is your message to America?
Thank you for giving me the moment to say this, right? So my message to America is that we cannot build healthy communities without investing in health and the well-being of people who serve them. So first responders, all of them, and 911, even doctors and teachers. I consider teachers to be first responders. So whether we're talking about public safety or people that are in education or government, people, we want them to make better decisions. When they're regulated, they can do that. When they're supported, they can do that, especially when it's connected to their values. In a time right now of division and uncertainty, we need more pausing. We need more listening, and we certainly need more humanity. The future of our communities really do depend on not only the better policies and policing and accountability, but on our ability to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is just take a breath, create the space, and choose how we show up for one another. So that's my message to America.
Oh man, give me chills. So yeah, we love you too.
That's my girl.
Well, I think before we go, we did have a few questions.
Sure.
That may have at least one or two. One question came in here.
Absolutely.
Let's put that one up there. Keep it on that thread. What gap would you identify in leadership that needs more attention? Ooh,
That's a great one.
That's
Who
a
is
great
that?
question. Handle is, yeah. That's a great question. I'm gonna let you talk on that one.
I know my girl.
Okay.
That's just in there dropping them. She knows how to do that. That's my girl.
Yeah.
So I think that the gap, I would say, where in leadership itself is the emotional intelligence. I think we do a good job of training leaders on tactics, policies, but their own ability to understand how they show up, how others are showing up. And I think emotional intelligence is one. The other is just communication. I've been around a lot of leaders who don't know how to communicate, especially with their teams and their people, right? They don't know what to say. They're uncomfortable. They've been put in uncomfortable spaces. And I think when you get into that leadership place, you need to be ready for anything. So your ability to understand your own emotions around things, your ability to understand the emotion of your people around you, and we always would hear, you need to take care of your people, take care of your people. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean just stand there and, be silent when they do something right. And when they do something wrong, we start to back up. For me, it is one of those things where leaders really need to understand their own emotional intelligence and why they react the way that they do. Because I often find too that a lot of leaders react in ways they don't know why they're reacting that way. And you know this because you've been through this, Shay. When you ask somebody or you question what, and then what is it? They start losing it, right? And I usually just watch it. It's like, because you just answer my question. You just answer my question because when I ask you, well, why are you reacting this way? Then it turns out, I'm your sergeant, I'm your lieutenant. It's like, that's not the question. These poor people, nowadays, these young kids they're not having it. And unless we get that part, you're still going to be struggling to hire. They ain't having all of that because I said so. You don't need to know why, Like, look, that's what I said, top shelf. I'm a beat Bobby Flay before I retire for a third time. But that's what I'm saying. People just need to, we need to figure out how are we going to do those things. So that question is spot on. But for me, that
is a great question, and something you mentioned too that was really impactful too is when you are questioned as a leader, the way you respond is really important too. Like I think there are elements where folks feel like if I'm a leader and you question me, then I'm being attacked, and they take it as such and they respond as such. And I think when we see that happen, that's how you get the a space where it's not psychologically safe, right? It becomes a danger zone almost. It's to work there, and you could tell that by the person that had to sit in their car 5 to 10 minutes before exiting the car.
Let me tell you, the people listening to this, they know that. They sat in those cars and talking yourself up and like, Lord, don't let me go in here. And I always tell people, the best thing about retiring and being over 60 is that I got your passport, the car key, what you need, where you need me to be. But we know that that's real. Right. And the psychological safety is 100%. But these words are new to law enforcement, psychological safety, right? Because that oftentimes is also related to a form of weakness. What do you mean you're not safe? You're a cop. right? But there's, we say that, but we know that we have been in those organizations where someone is saying or doing something to you and you have no recourse. And at some point, as we say, when those things compound and build up and you react, all of a sudden now you're the problem. And so, we have a lot of work.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a okay. My eyes are starting to play tricks on me right now because it's I've been on the screen too long. That's a problem with working from home. You're on the screen all day long. But Dr. Keesee is reminding me strongly of my brother-in-law, who was a retired Miami cop, who unfortunately could not get over the hypervigilance he was trained in. He carried a gun everywhere, even in retired life. Always had to sit in place that gave him full view of the room and all of the entrance and the exits. I've seen that a lot too, by the way. Yeah. He said he died of cancer a few years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah. And maybe partially the price of the stress he healing at the time. Yeah. And Sarah, shout out to Sarah, my Walking Wednesday partner there. Sarah is always walking with me every Wednesday, 7:30 in the morning. But that's a really impactful statement, Sarah. Thank you for sharing and being vulnerable.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. And but it's a reality. And at the end of that, she mentioned, he dies of pancreatic cancer. It's exactly what's happening here. We just did our survey of retirees, police and fire. The number one thing as retirees that they struggle with is the loss of identity. The second thing that they struggle with is they don't belong anywhere. And so whatever they've learned, they hold on to that. And, Sarah, thank you again for sharing that. But that's what you get. You he was never taught that there's a time when you can let that go. And that does things to the community too. If you're always thinking the community is going to attack you, that's not a good space to be in as well. So I appreciate Sarah sharing that.
Yeah. Well, Tracie, it has been a pleasure. I want to remind folks that the book is out there. Please scan the QR code. I know we dropped the link multiple times during this conversation, but check out Tracie and the Just Breathe podcast and definitely get the book, Just Breathe. And Tracie, I knew this was going to be an impactful conversation. And I really love the information and analysis you dropped on us tonight. Any final words before I play us out?
No, thank you as always for you. You carry the word. We all come here because your fingers on the pulse. You know exactly what we need to be talking about. So I appreciate you and thank you. And thank you as always.
All right, Tracie, stay on the call until afterwards, and everyone else have a great night.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Tell us what you really mean, ma'am. Law enforcement officers should be role models, period. If you can't be a mentor, you shouldn't have that uniform.
I could take a break from this world.
All my blinders are taken off. I can see what you guys are talking about. Y'all don't see what we're talking about yet. Policing is the law enforcement arm of systemic racism.
Well, the message for America is that they need to wake up. We need to stop the repeat. We need to stop the revolving door. And we need to come up with better ways of law enforcement. Criminal justice reform needs to reflect what it is. Ain't no way in the world somebody should be sitting in jail with a $1 bill for months.